Hello everybody and welcome to this video. Today we are going to be talking about a favourite topic of mine, art and video games. I've literally written and had a book published on this topic, so it is pretty important to me. But every so often something happens which makes me wonder whether we, as an industry, really do believe that video games are art at all. The industry loves to tout itself as an artistic medium, but come crunch time, it tends to behave like it has no idea what art actually is. This time around, the centre of the discourse is The Last of Us 2. Now, I kind of knew that this would happen with the game because while I don't believe that it is a particularly intelligent or deep game, and others may disagree with me, and that is fine, that is really not the scope of this discussion, the developers and publishers were very successful in promoting the game as dark and emotionally challenging and framing it in a way that would suggest that it is art. Regardless of where you come down on it, however, the problem is not so much that the game may or may not be the Schindler's List of video games, as one critic very poorly put it. The problem is that we are not talking about the game as art at all, even if we are the ones that believe that it is. So Troy Baker, a voice actor that worked on the game, and Neil Druckmann, the creative director on the project, both obviously believe that the game is art for obvious reasons. They have in recent weeks laid into a couple of people, or a fair few people perhaps, on Twitter who have been critical of the game or have not contributed to the discourse in a way that they would like us to. That is ironic, since the embargo restrictions on the game prevented critics from engaging with almost anything to do with plot points in the game, meaning we weren't able to contribute to the discourse in a meaningful way. This led to a spot-on article from Polygon that highlighted the challenges that we face in the industry in talking about any reasonably high-profile game on any meaningful level. As the piece states, the protective shield around The Last of Us 2 can be seen any time the creatives or talent behind the game jump into critical conversations about it. It's made talking about the game exhausting. On the one hand, we have bigots trying their hardest to tear the game down for its inclusion of queer characters. On the other, we've got the people who actually made the game putting their figurative fists up. On the third hand, go with it, we've got fans and professional critics trying to share their own takes of the game, good and bad and everything in between. I will put a link to that article underneath this video in the description section. It is worth a read because it backs up a lot of what I'm saying here. Now, it's not just The Last of Us 2 where we see issues, of course. It's virtually any reasonably high-profile game. Any effort to discuss the game outside of a stupidly restrictive bunch of parameters is enough to incite anger, if not from the developers themselves, then certainly the community. And it takes a number of forms, and I'll just list out some of them to highlight what I'm talking about here in this video. Firstly, the discussion of a game in any other frame other than how much fun it is. This one comes up over and 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 over again, especially to those of us that choose to view games as art and therefore understand that it is possible for games to have focuses other than their entertainment value. Literature doesn't have to be fun. If you've ever watched films like Gaspar Noé's Irreversible, then you would understand that cinema does not have to be entertainment to be valuable. While we're using that word, entertainment is the wrong word to describe a trip to the ballet, opera, or theatre. You may use other words like enlightening, or beautiful, or artful. You're not going to call it entertainment, even though technically it probably is, but it is not the right word to frame a discussion about the art. Look, art exists for many reasons. It can entertain, of course it can, and I'm certainly not denying that. But art also fulfills so many other important roles in our society. It educates, it challenges. At many points in history, they burned books, they destroyed paintings, and they imprisoned artists. And they didn't do that because they were entertaining people. That was definitely not the point. There are some subversive artists out there that have been entertaining, but that's always been secondary to what they're actually doing and why they were considered to be dangerous. It's not fun, it's intelligent. If you genuinely care about the idea that games are art, then you're going to have to move past this idea that fun is even an inherent criteria for a game to be good. That is just not the case. Secondly, spoiler culture. If we can't talk about art, then it is not art. It is as simple as that. A core purpose and value to art is that it encourages discussion and the exchange of ideas. If you can't discuss the work, then there is an ulterior motive going on that has absolutely nothing to do with the art itself. With the games industry, that ulterior motive is blatant. It is because the industry sees these things as products to sell. After all, if you already know the plot of a game, then you may not want to pay the developer money for it. At no point does the developer care about the artistic integrity of the work, of course. They just care about making sure that they can get every dollar possible from people who maybe don't know what they're going into, but have been sold on the game through the marketing materials. There is a rare instance where a twist in the narrative is so significant that to know about it ahead of time would actually affect your interpretation of the text as you experience it. One example would be Bruce Willis's character in The Sixth Sense. If you go into the movie knowing that that character is dead, it can change your interpretation of the film entirely. If you know that the narrator of Agatha Christie's The Murderer of Roger Ackroyd is the murderer, then it also changes your interpretation of that book as you read it. Those artists that were behind those works would be rightfully concerned that spoilers would undermine what they were doing with their work. Those twists are what an entire artwork is built on, though. Both of those examples I gave had the one twist, which was the entire focus of the entire narrative and theme of the experience. And by nature, there can only really be one of those in an artwork. But you look at video games and the spoiler lists that we have to deal with as critics, and they are so long and so deep that even completely mundane plot points seem to count as these spoilers. Just basic things, sometimes that happen in the first couple of minutes of a game, are actually we're actually blocked from talking about because of these spoilers. They're not twists, they're just plot points. And whether it's the developer and the publisher themselves, or the fans that end up screeching at you for ruining a game if you're not careful with spoilers, spoiler culture is an active effort to stop us talking about games as critics. You would never show such disrespect to something you actually considered to be art to suggest that nobody can actually talk about that thing until you've had a chance to experience it, and even then you can only talk about it in the small circles of people who have experienced it. That is not how art works. Art is about discussion broadly with a lot of people, and that is just something we don't see in video games, particularly at the blockbuster end of things. 3. The fixation on scores. Every critic has to deal with this. We do the scoring thing because being listed on Metacritic is absolutely critical for our ability to work and to get our words out there. But it's getting to the point where it's almost intimidating to give a high-profile game a low score, or even a high score, because the moment you do, you get swamped by fans that tear you a new one for daring to break ranks over what they've already decided the score should be. Often it happens with games that haven't even been released yet. The fans haven't had any chance to play it whatsoever. They are just basing their interpretation of your score entirely against what other critics have written and the marketing materials. That is how anti-art this industry behaves at times. People form opinions on things they've never experienced beyond the carefully cultivated marketing material. These people never read the reviews, or if they do so very disingenuously. It happens to me all the time. People pour over thousands of words of argument that you've constructed to find that one line that they can disagree with, and then attack your entire review for the score they disagree with over that one line. There's no discussion around the review itself, the themes that the review talks about, or the issues that it has. And part of the problem is the aforementioned spoiler thing. It becomes very hard to talk about some of these themes because we can't give away spoilers. But nonetheless, it is all about the score. The readers that are inclined to attack you over your reviews, they never actually read the review. They just skim it. They find one or two things, perhaps, if they can be bothered to do so, but otherwise they just hit you over the score. Now, the effort to reduce the analysis of games to a mathematical score is inherently anti-art. Because again, art is about discussion. And you're not discussing anything to do with the artwork when you're just fixated on the score. what you're concerned with in that circumstance is the viability of the art as a product, because that is all the score is really pointing to. It is just a way of giving you a very general idea about whether the game is worth playing or not. That is all a score is able to achieve, and people focus on that because in the absence of wanting to talk about the game as a work of art, they instead decide to focus on it as a product. But again, that is an inherently anti-art position to take. Fourth, and finally for the scope of this video, the discussion of games as content. Now, I've done a dedicated video on this in the past, but the way that we allow ourselves to think about games as content is inherently anti-art. The value of art has nothing to do with how much of it there is. The value of art is the message of the piece. Content, by contrast, is a marketing word. It's actually derived from the marketing idea that content is king, and it is completely unconcerned with the message itself. The only concern of the word content and the only implications that it has is quantity. Quantity is easier to sell than a message, much, much easier. Every time you talk about how long a game is, as a way of determining whether it is worth it or not, you are buying into the premise that a 1 hour long masterpiece with an incredible artistic vision is not as viable as a 100-hour long thing that is empty and meaningless but just occupies a lot of your time. Some of the greatest books are just a few dozen pages long. Poetry by nature, and I don't think anybody would disagree that poetry is an art form, poetry by nature values brevity. It is about getting your message across in as fewer words as possible. And on top of all of that, if you use length to justify price, which is a very common discussion in this industry, do I get my money's worth, in other words, then again, you do need to be aware that you are diminishing the value of the work, of the game as a work of art, to instead frame it as a product. If games really are art, then the discussion about how much they cost would be secondary at best. I'm actively involved in the ballet world as an example, and absolutely nobody in that world talks about the cost of tickets to the ballet over the experience of the ballet itself. Ballet tickets are expensive, people do mention that. But at the same time, once you're in that ballet hall, you are there watching the ballet, and that's all you talk about on the trip home. You're not actually talking about the price of the thing. But in this industry, everything is so focused on price and monetization and value for money that it just undermines any artistic discussions that you may have. There are so many examples of times I've tried to engage with a game as a work of art, and the first comment has been, oh, it's too expensive, I'll wait for it to be on sale or whatever. Nobody engages with the themes, they're talking about the price of the thing. And that is just not how the art world thinks. I understand that, of course, video games are a very accessible medium, and a lot of people are playing games who don't necessarily have huge financial means, and I also understand that video games can be expensive as a hobby, especially if you buy a lot of them. But again, if we're talking about video games as art forms, we need to remove them from that discussion, and we just are not very good at doing that as an industry. Those are just 4 examples that we see come up over and over again. There are more that we can talk about. One is the fixation that the industry has with incremental technical improvements to get better graphics or better frame rates over developing ways to deepen thematic engagement. We've all seen the PlayStation 5 and Xbox shows. We've seen all this new gen stuff, the Epic game demo, and every single time it has focused on the very superficial enhanced graphics and better performance and all that kind of stuff, which is important for game developers, of course, and it is important for the commercial viability of games. We do like to see with each generation some kind of improvement, but there has been no discussion about the artistic side of video games with any of the stuff that we've seen go on so far. There's been no talk about how this is going to improve storytelling. There's been no talk about how developers are trying new things to express themes and explore ideas. None of that. They've just very much focused on the technical stuff, because the technical stuff is so much easier to treat as content and get away with treating as content. When you try to treat story as content or narrative as content, then people ask questions. They just do. They want to know what it all means. And then you have to have a discussion about the game as a work of art. If you just focus the conversation on the technical elements, then you are pretty much guaranteed that everybody will go away content with the content that you're offering. Another one is the fact that writers tend to be brought into projects much, much later on, and only after the gameplay and technical basis has already been determined. We've already seen so many examples of video games that are basically complete before the writer has been brought on to just fill the gaps. And in filling the gaps and giving some context, you're ready to then ship the product. But if you think about games as art, as a storytelling thing, or even just as a message to share. If you think about games as a message to share, then you need to have the writer involved really early on. You can't start a film without having a script. You can't write a novel without having an idea in your head about what story you want to tell. And video games are still a storytelling medium, especially the artistic ones. And if we're going to engage with games as art, we need to have more respect for the storytelling side of things and not just shove it in once we've already figured out what the game will be. So to bring all of that together, do we really genuinely accept games as art? Do we actually walk the walk and treat games as art, or do we just talk about them as art before going back to instead behaving like they're just a product? We like to claim that games are art. When somebody from outside of the industry, like Roger Ebert, derides the artistic quality of games, we all start creating these long lists of games that prove that that damn Ebert is wrong. We just love to do that. We get very defensive if anybody was to suggest that video games are not a work of art or a medium of art. And yet, we so rarely actually engage with games as artworks. Whether it's developers and publishers slapping embargoes on every line of dialogue, fans screeching at the critics if they don't give their favourite game a 95 average on Metacritic, or consumer advocates whining endlessly on about things that nobody actually has to buy. We're not talking about games as artworks. We just don't do that. There is very little relative to the rest of the discussions that happen in the industry that focus on the artistic side of video games. So just one final note, because I do need to have this disclaimer, I think. If you don't believe that games are art, then that is totally fine. You and I disagree on that topic, but you are more than welcome to see games as toys and products if that is where your interest lies, and there is nothing whatsoever wrong with that. If you are purely looking at video games as an entertainment thing, then you don't have to see them as art, and that's just logic. But what you can't do is then expect video games to have the same level of respect in mainstream society that other art forms do. You can't demand that games are treated like Nerf toys in terms of how we talk about them and discuss them, but then also decide that, everybody needs to respect them like they do the ballet. That is just, you can't have your cake and eat it too in that instance. If you see games as art, then you have to treat them as art. If you see them as a toy, then they are just going to be a toy. If you do believe games are art, then that is great, and we do agree on that's why I've done this whole video. But you should also check yourself to see how you talk about and think about games. There are a lot of very, very smart people that I have the world of respect for and would happily agree with that games are art, but immediately afterwards they will fall into the trap of talking about them as products and toys. It's very easy to do, and it's not their fault, because the entire developer and publisher side of this industry wants us to see games as product, not art. They may pretend that they care about games as art, but ultimately these are people who wear suits, don't really have any idea about art. They're just after the money, and art is generally not as profitable as product. So the industry really does want us not to talk about video games as art. So a lot of people who think of games as art end up falling into the trap of talking in the way that the publishers and developers want them to. We should resist that urge where we can, though, as much as possible. It's hard. I fall into the trap as much as anybody else. So this is just an industry-wide thing. Anyway, that is enough for this video. It was a longer one. Thanks for tuning in. I hope it was interesting, and I hope we can have a discussion about this in the comments, because this is a topic that fascinates me. I have strong feelings and thoughts about it. I'm sure other people do, and we can nut it out in the comments. Hopefully it's a productive discussion, because I think that this is a topic worth talking about. Thanks as always for tuning in. If you do enjoy my videos, please do consider subscribing, because that way you won't miss any, and we can have more fun chats like this down the track. Just click the subscribe button and the bell. If you click the bell, you will get a notification every time I upload a new video. Please do consider backing me on Patreon. That helps. It really, really does help. Even $1 a month actually goes a long way for me to be able to grow this channel and do more interesting things with it. And if you would rather support us in another way, you can buy our visual novels. I do produce a series of visual novels. We've got 3 out currently. And in buying them, you get a good solid couple of hours of gameplay to talk about content. You get some pretty neat visual novels that people seem to be enjoying. So it's a big help if you want to do it that way as well. Thank you for always watching. Have a great weekend since it is Friday, if I don't upload another video in the meantime. And we will see you at the other end. Thank you.